there, this is S.J. Thomason with Christian-Apologist.com, and today we're going to talk about whether or not Jesus rose from the dead. So to do this conversation, what I'm going to do to start is I'm going to present the opening of a debate that David Wood had with John Loftus, because I felt like he made a really effective argument. And today we're going to talk about whether or not Jesus rose from the dead. So to do this conversation, what I'm going to do to start is I'm going to present the opening of a debate that David Wood had with John Loftus. Let me see if I can find where this is coming from. Got some. Okay, here it is. I found the source of the excess noise. Okay, so here we go. We're going to watch the beginning of this debate. So they had just gotten introduced at this point, and David Wood is going to come to the screen. And so let's go ahead and listen. Before I do that, I just realized I need to do my screen share again, which I had closed out. Let's go ahead and look at this. Make sure we got the sound. Okay, here we go.
Reston Bible Church for hosting our debate tonight. The resurrection of Jesus offers answers to more of the big questions than any other event in history. Does God exist? If so, does he care about us? Is there life after death? Do miracles occur? How can we know the true religion? Questions like that. And we had our answers to these questions when a group of women showed up at the tomb of Jesus and were greeted by an angel who said, "Do not be afraid, for I know that you are looking for Jesus who was crucified. He is not here, he has risen, just as he said."
Let me highlight a strength of this argument right off the bat is the fact that he's identifying the fact that there were women who made the most important discovery in the Bible. So that was something that's very notable because women were treated as second-class citizens back then. Their testimony, according to Josephus, was not even considered credible. So the fact that the women were the first to make the discovery of Jesus, as reported in all four Gospels, is notable. Thank you.
The early Christians defended this proclamation against critics, and it's an honor to carry on that defense nearly 2,000 years later. I'd also like to thank my friend John for representing the atheist position. This is my third debate with John, and his dedication continues to amaze me. I don't think Christians appreciate the sacrifice many of our atheist friends make when they spend so much of their time talking about Christianity. Anyone can understand why Christians want to discuss these issues. We believe they have eternal significance. But for atheists who are convinced that their existence ends in just a few decades, to spend those decades unwaveringly focused on Jesus and the Bible, we can only marvel that they're so generous with the little bit of time they've got. If I didn't know better, which I don't, I might think there's something spiritual going on here. But more on this later. We love you, John.
You're a good man, David.
Did Jesus rise from the dead? The short answer, yes. The long answer, yes.
This is just so beautiful. I have to say one of the reasons I'm playing this video is because I love all of the approaches that David Wood used in this. And so let's keep going.
And having a verifiable miracle at its core is one of the most important differences between Christianity and its competitors. I find it fascinating that atheists dogmatically insist that the message of Christianity is just put your blind faith in our religion, when Christianity, more than any other worldview I'm aware of, has always said, here's how you can know that this is true. In the book of Acts, the Apostle Paul says to the people of Athens, tells them that God has set a day when he will judge the world with justice by the man he has appointed. He has given proof of this to everyone by raising him from the dead. So if Christians proclaim, here's the proof, why do atheists here just believe without any evidence whatsoever? It's as if hearing they do not hear and seeing they do not see. But for those with ears to hear, knowing that Jesus rose from the dead is actually much simpler than people realize. To know that Jesus rose from the dead, we only need to know two things. One, that he was dead, and two, that he was alive again later. If Jesus was dead and he was alive again later, I'd say that our atheist friends have a great big Son of God-shaped hole in their worldview. I doubt that John and I are going to have any disagreement on whether Jesus was dead, because we both studied the sources, and Jesus' death by crucifixion is one of the best established facts of ancient history. Now, the new generation of atheists who learn about Christianity primarily from websites or social media may be surprised to hear that there are historical facts about Jesus. They think of Jesus as a mythical figure, like Hercules, except that they're much angrier about Jesus for some reason. It's a tragedy of the internet age that positions that would be laughed out of the room at the scholarly level can become quite popular at the internet level by circulating among people who don't know much about a topic. At the scholarly level, Jesus mythers are thought of as along the same lines as Holocaust deniers, but at the internet level, it seems like every other atheist I run into says Jesus never existed. Really? Well, what books have you read on this? None, but I watched like 3 YouTube videos, so I'm obviously more knowledgeable than every respected scholar on the planet. Meanwhile, even some of the most critical historical Jesus scholars will acknowledge certain facts about Jesus. That he was baptized by John the Baptist, that he had disciples, that he was known as a miracle worker and an exorcist, that he believed he played a crucial role in the coming of the kingdom of God, and of course that he died by crucifixion. The scholarly consensus on Jesus' death arises from having a variety of ancient sources. There are Christian, Jewish, and Roman sources reporting Jesus' death, and knowing how crucifixion works. Today we tend to think of crucifixion as just nailing someone to a cross, but Roman crucifixion was a 3-step process. The first step was the scourging, which was sometimes called the half-death, because victims would be half dead by the time it was finished. The Romans used a flagrum made of leather thongs with chunks of bone and metal woven into the strands, designed for removing human flesh. We have records of people being beaten until their veins and arteries were exposed, or until their bones were showing, or until their intestines spilled out. Julius Caesar remarked, "It is more grievous to be scourged than to be put to death." And that was just the beginning. Step 2 was nailing the victim to a cross and letting him hang there while blood drained out of him. Once he stopped gasping for breath, the Romans knew their work was done. Almost. The Romans didn't take crucifixion lightly, so there was a third step, a death blow, just to make sure their victim was dead. If they needed to pry someone off a cross, they would smash his head in or stab him through the heart with a sword or a spear, or set him on fire, or let wild animals rip him apart. Not the sort of process anyone's going to walk away from. So Jesus' death isn't simply a point of Christian doctrine, it's a fact of history, as even non-Christian scholars are happy to admit.
So let's build on this for a second. One of the things that he's noting that's really important that people should note is he's about to point out a number of people who are not Christians who assert and support the idea that Jesus was crucified under Pontius Pilate. But also just to mention is how significant is the crucifixion. If you consider the fact that this man who was crucified as a slave, so is lower, on the level of a slave, was put to death, and suddenly his ministry and his influence ends up going across the entire world. One must understand that this was divinely inspired. This is something that's miraculous when you consider the way he died, how humiliating it would have been back in those days, and how his apostles all came to the conclusion after he died, and even after they had been hiding, because of course the women, as they discovered the empty tomb, the men at the time were in hiding. So after they went in hiding, they came out of hiding and declared that he had risen, and they preached for him despite massive persecution over the next few decades. So let's go on.
Atheist New Testament scholar Gerd Ludemann declares that Jesus' death as a consequence of crucifixion is indisputable. John Dominic Crossan of the infamous Jesus Seminar says that there is not the slightest doubt about the fact of Jesus' crucifixion under Pontius Pilate. Marcus Borg, another member of the Jesus Seminar, states that Jesus' execution is the most certain fact about the historical Jesus. Jewish scholar Pinchas Lapid concludes that Jesus' death by crucifixion is historically certain. According to Paula Fredrickson, a convert to Judaism, the single most solid fact about Jesus' life is his death. He was executed by the Roman prefect Pilate on or around Passover in the manner Rome reserved particularly for political insurrectionists, namely crucifixion. And as everyone's favorite scholarly critic of Christianity, Bart Ehrman, maintains, one of the most certain facts of history is that Jesus was crucified on orders of the Roman prefect of Judea, Pontius Pilate. The real question for us tonight, then, is whether Jesus was alive again. How would we know if Jesus was alive at some point following his execution by the Romans? Same way we know many other things from history. We need witnesses, and we need to know that we can trust these witnesses. Do we have witnesses of the risen Jesus? Yes, lots. Fortunately, they began preaching almost immediately, and we have summaries of some of their early sermons. They issued official creedal statements that could be easily memorized and passed on to others. They sent out representatives with authoritative traditions that would eventually be incorporated into the Gospels and other writings. We also have writings and quotations outside the New Testament from the next generation of Christian leaders, which included people like Clement of Rome and Polycarp, who knew one or more of the apostles and who continued preaching the message of the apostles, especially the resurrection of Jesus. But the most interesting source on the eyewitnesses of the risen Jesus is an early Christian creed recorded in 1 Corinthians 15, 3 through 7. 1 Corinthians was written around AD 55, and Paul says in the letter that he had already delivered the creed to the church in Corinth, which would have been several years earlier. But Paul received the creed long before that, either when he visited the apostles in Jerusalem or perhaps even at his conversion, and scholars date its formulation to within a few years of Jesus' crucifixion. James D.G. Dunn writes, "This tradition, we can be entirely confident, was formulated as tradition within months of Jesus' death." According to Michael Goulder, Paul received the tradition, that is, he was taught it at his conversion perhaps 2 years after Jesus' death. Ulrich Wilkins says that the creed indubitably goes back to the oldest phase of all in the history of primitive Christianity. Gerrit Ludemann maintains that the elements in the tradition are to be dated to the first 2 years after the crucifixion of Jesus. Paul Barnett dates the creed to within 2 or 3 years of the first Easter. Richard Burridge and Graham Gould say it dates from only a few years after Jesus' death. Robert Funk in the Jesus Seminar put it within 2 or 3 years at most. Richard Hayes says it originates within about 3 years after Jesus was crucified in Jerusalem, and Alexander Wedderburn asserts that it goes back to the first half of the 30s. So there's widespread agreement among scholars that from across the theological spectrum that 1 Corinthians 15 contains very early material that goes right back to the original apostles of Jesus shortly after his death.
See, this particular statement, if we look at the age of 1 Corinthians 15 and the fact that it comes about within a couple of years of Jesus' crucifixion, which I have estimated before is in the year 33. So within a few years of the year 33, we see evidence that people had already come up with this creed. And so that refutes the position of Jesus mythicism. So anyone who follows Richard Carrier or other people who are mythicists should move past that, and actually at least accept the idea that Jesus was around and is an historical figure. And another reason to mention that particular point is to also refute the idea that the legend. So some people will talk about C.S. Lewis's trilemma, and they'll add on this legend idea. But as you can see, because we have this creed, this eliminates the notion of a legend.
Let's read the passage. Paul writes, "For I delivered to you, the Christians of Corinth, as of first importance," this is foundational information, "what I also received." Begin creed that Paul received, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, that's Peter.
Now, also make note of this. The fact that they refer to Peter as Cephas also dates this to an older date, because that was, Cephas was the original name. That was how Peter was referred in the early years. And so calling him Cephas is something that's consistent with something that's very new relative to the Christian, relative to Jesus' resurrection. Now, I also want to point out something in this particular statement. See right here, it says, "and that he was buried." Okay. That is a key point, because a lot of people try to make the argument that there was no empty tomb and that Jesus was put into some sort of a mass grave. However, we have no evidence that Jesus was put into a mass grave. Instead, we have evidence that he was buried by Joseph of Arimathea, who ironically was a member of the Sanhedrin, and the Sanhedrin was a group that voted to condemn Jesus and to crucify him. So Joseph of Arimathea had Jesus buried in his own tomb. And so this is recorded in the Gospels. And of course, it's also noted here from Paul that he was buried. So this speaks against this idea that his body was just tossed into this mass grave.
Then to the 12. After that, he appeared to more than 500 brethren at one time. Paul is writing this years later, so he adds parenthetically, most of whom remain until now, but some have fallen asleep.
Note that point right there as well, because when you see most of whom remain until now, but some have fallen asleep, this is Paul telling the people who are reading it in much later centuries that there are people around at the time he had come out with his letter to the Corinthians who could deny or doubt or cast doubt on any of the things he was saying. So he's saying that there were people around, and there are people maybe even in the crowds, who could confirm his assertions about Jesus.
Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles. The original would have ended with the appearance to all the apostles, but Jesus appeared to Paul later, so Paul adds, and last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared to me also.
Atheists a lot of times try to make the claim that Paul did not see Jesus, but Paul makes it quite clear that yes, Jesus did appear to him. So the claim that Paul did not see Jesus, or there was no eyewitness accounts, is baloney, because we have this evidence right here. I also would like you to note a few things. Noting that he appeared to Peter, James, and Paul, these three people each had it out or had doubts for Christianity. For example, James, who's Jesus' half-brother, he tried to stop Jesus' ministry. During his ministry, he obviously doubted that Jesus was divine. You have Peter, who doubted. Remember when he doubted when he tried to walk on water with Jesus, and he also denied Jesus 3 times. So he did not want to be crucified. He did not want to suffer the same fate. And so we have that sort of evidence. And then, of course, we have Paul. And what happened with Paul was on the road to Damascus. While Paul was persecuting Christians, Jesus appeared to him. So it's pretty significant.
Notice what we have here. We have Jesus' death for sins, his burial, his resurrection on the 3rd day, and numerous appearances. And we have all of it as authoritative tradition within a few years, if not within months, of the crucifixion. As for the appearances, there are appearances to individuals, Peter, James, the brother of Jesus, and eventually Paul, to small groups, the 12 and all the apostles, and to a large group. He appeared to more than 500. The list also reports appearances to both friends and foes. Peter and the apostles were followers of Jesus during his 3-year ministry, but James and Paul weren't. James didn't believe that his brother was the Messiah when Jesus was preaching in Galilee and Judea, and Paul persecuted the church and tried to destroy it. Yet they're all listed as witnesses who saw Jesus alive again sometime after his death. This passage eliminates 2 skeptical responses to Jesus' resurrection. The legend hypothesis and the hallucination hypothesis. At the internet level, there are still people who claim that Christian belief in Jesus' resurrection arose through a process of legendary development over a period of many decades. But this is factually false. We know as a fact of history that the resurrection was the heart of Christian preaching from the beginning. You also may have heard people argue that Jesus' disciples simply hallucinated the resurrection appearances. But a hallucination, by definition, is something that occurs in the mind of the person experiencing it. If my friend Paul here takes a bunch of acid and a leprechaun appears to him, the rest of us aren't going to ask for his pot of gold because we're not going to see him. It's only in Paul's mind. The leprechaun doesn't exist outside of his mind. So we can't attribute the resurrection appearances to legend or hallucinations. Jesus appeared to multiple people on multiple occasions. Can we attribute them to deception? Were the disciples lying about the appearances? That's what I thought before I was a Christian. But there's a fatal flaw in the deception hypothesis. Liars make poor martyrs. Some human beings are willing to die for what they believe in. I've never met anyone who's willing to die for something he made up. In the book of Acts, chapter 4, Peter and John are arrested and threatened. In Acts 5, the apostles are put in jail and flogged. In Acts 12, James, the brother of John, is put to death by Herod, and Peter is again put in jail. The apostle Paul describes his life as a Christian in 2 Corinthians 11, 12, 24 to 27. He writes, 5 times I received from the Jews 39 lashes. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. A night and a day I've spent in the deep. I've been on frequent journeys in dangers from rivers, dangers from robbers, dangers from my countrymen, dangers from the Gentiles, dangers in the city, dangers in the wilderness, dangers on the sea, dangers among false brethren. I have been in labor and hardship through many sleepless nights, and hunger and thirst, often without food, and cold and exposure. Become a Christian.
Now, just note that this is really important to note, is the way that Christians were persecuted. And this is not just something that's in the Bible. So David does reference a biblical reference. However, we have plenty of extra biblical support for the martyrdoms of the apostles and also for the martyrdoms of other Christians at that time. In fact, you can go to Tacitus, to see one example. Tacitus talks a lot about Nero and the way that Nero basically demonized the Christians and accused them of causing the Great Fire in Rome. And so what he did to punish the Christians is he marched them out in his stadium. He would march around in a chariot, apparently, and Tacitus does report this. And so there's another example of Pliny the Younger, who also supports the idea of Christian persecution. And there are many, many more examples. And so we have ancient support that says that Christians were crucified, beheaded, and other sort of treatments. So let's continue.
Christian, it's a great life. The Jewish historian Josephus reports that James, the brother of Jesus, was stoned to death as a lawbreaker. Clement of Rome invites his readers to keep in mind the sufferings and martyrdoms of Peter and Paul. So the apostles didn't just preach that they had seen Jesus alive again. They were willing to endure prison, floggings, and death as they preached. And that means they really believed what they were saying. Here again, it's not just Christians who draw this conclusion. Even non-Christians maintain that the disciples sincerely believed that they had seen Jesus. Gerrit Ludemann, it may be taken as historically certain that Peter and the disciples had experiences after Jesus' death in which he appeared to them as the risen Christ. Bart Ehrman, we can say with complete certainty that some of his disciples at some later time insisted that he had soon appeared to them, convincing them that he had been raised from the dead.
It's really compelling because I look at these statements that are coming from agnostics and atheists, and I ask myself, what conclusion do you draw? Is it an emotional appeal to say that Christianity is not true and that Jesus didn't rise from the dead? When the apostles made that claim themselves, what do they use? They can't say now that it's a hallucination, since, as David rightly pointed out, that's something that's inside a person's mind, sort of similar to a dream. If I dream that I'm going to Maui, as Mike Licona has said, I don't, take my husband with me, and he dreams also that we're in Maui and we are dreaming the same dream together. This just doesn't happen. He's also eliminated the potential for swoon theory. Swoon theory is this theory that has been sort of debunked years ago, and it's the idea that Jesus really didn't die when he was on the cross, and so he recovered while he was in the tomb, and that is something that's been debunked because, again, we have the evidence that people, even historians who are atheists and agnostics, admit that Jesus was crucified. And so we have two key points that to explain these, you have to come up with something, and so far David has done a very good job of refuting the alternative hypotheses.
Bart Ehrman again, it is a historical fact that some of Jesus' followers came to believe that he had been raised from the dead soon after his crucifixion. Paula Fredrickson, I know in their own terms what they saw was the raised Jesus. I'm not saying that they really did see the raised Jesus. I wasn't there. I don't know what they saw, but I do know as a historian they must have seen something. Fredrickson says she doesn't know what they saw, but I do. I think it's obvious what they saw. The disciples saw the sort of thing that would convince individuals and groups, friends and foes, that they had all seen a man who had been dead, alive again, standing in front of them, telling them why he had to die and rise again. Unfortunately for our atheist friends, the only sort of thing that can do that is Jesus actually appearing to them, which means that Jesus rose from the dead. So there's only one conclusion to draw from the facts that even atheist and agnostic scholars grant as historically certain. And yet, atheist and agnostic scholars clearly don't believe Jesus rose from the dead. Why do they reject the resurrection when they're aware of the historical evidence? Different people will give different reasons for denying Jesus' resurrection, but if you do a little digging, two broad issues emerge most frequently. First, many people have a prior commitment to naturalism. Supernatural explanations are ruled out before the investigation begins. And if supernatural explanations are ruled out prior to investigation, Jesus' resurrection is never even a candidate for belief. So is a commitment to naturalism a good reason to reject the resurrection? As Alvin Plantinga and others have shown, naturalism as a worldview is fundamentally incoherent because it ends up undermining the cognitive faculties required to affirm it. But a more glaring difficulty, given a discussion of miracles, is the global abundance of miracle claims. In 2006, the Pew Forum issued a report titled Spirit and Power, a 10-country survey of Pentecostals. discussing statistics on Pentecostal and charismatic Protestants in the United States, Brazil, Chile, Guatemala, Kenya, Nigeria, South Africa, India, the Philippines, and South Korea. And the researchers found that approximately 200 million Pentecostal and charismatic Protestants in just those 10 countries believe that they have personally witnessed miraculous healings. And that's not counting other kinds of Christians in those countries or Christians in other countries around the world.
I want to build on one point. I see somebody in the audience, and I just want to make sure that this comment doesn't fly away without getting something. Josephus also, we have the idea of confirmation that Peter and Paul were both martyred, but we also have confirmation that Josephus stated that James, Jesus' half-brother, was also martyred. And Josephus, again, was a non-Christian who made this assertion. And also what Josephus said, he would actually know because Josephus just happened to live in Jerusalem where James, Jesus' half-brother, was preaching. So Josephus would have been possibly a witness, or at least a first-hand account, or a second-hand account from somebody he knew very closely in the same city of Jerusalem. So Josephus is able to speak to that pretty well. Going to the miracles idea, now of course John Loftus later on in this is going to try to refute all of these miracles, 200 million miracles. He's going to try to make the claim that people are just superstitious. And so he's basically saying 200 million people who make these claims are superstitious. Then he gets to the point, and he's going to talk about China, and he's going to say that all of China is essentially superstitious. And so thinking that, I think that it takes a lot of faith to have this atheist position.
Consider miracle reports in China. According to Edmund Tang, all Christian churches in China practice some form of healing. In fact, according to some surveys, 90% of new believers cite healing as a reason for their conversion. This is especially true in the countryside where medical facilities are often inadequate or non-existent. After reviewing a number of miracle reports from around the world, Craig Keener concludes, it is no longer plausible to tout uniform human experience as a basis for denying miracles, as in the traditional modern argument. Hundreds of millions of claims would have to be satisfactorily explained in non-supernatural terms for this appeal to succeed. While many may be so explained, one cannot adopt the conclusion of uniformity as a premise without investigating all of them. In other words, those who exclude supernatural explanations prior to investigation do so by faith, not because the evidence demands it. Second, it's perhaps even more common to reject the resurrection because of what the resurrection implies. If we believe that Jesus rose from the dead, we might think it's a good idea to listen to what he says. But Jesus said all kinds of things about sin and judgment and salvation, and if we don't want to take his teaching seriously, or if we don't want to become Christians, or if we despise anything that has anything to do with Christianity, we kind of need to get rid of that whole rising from the dead thing. Now, this has always seemed like an odd approach to me. Decide what we want to believe ahead of time and then reject evidence that doesn't line up with what we want to believe. And atheists normally condemn this approach. Suppose an atheist comes to you with some kind of evidence, let's say evidence for common descent, that all human beings share an ancestor with all other organisms. If your response is, well, I don't like what that would mean, I don't like what common descent implies, so I'm going to reject any evidence you give me for it, the atheist will accuse you of being anti-science and anti-evidence and irrational and bigoted and every other thing you can think of. But then if you turn to that same atheist and present historical facts about the resurrection of Jesus, you'll suddenly find that heaven and hell and the Salem witch trials and gay wedding cakes and all kinds of other topics are entering into his evaluation of whether Jesus was dead and whether he was alive again afterwards. Feelings become the ultimate trump card. But if atheists want to bring their feelings about Christianity into a discussion of historical facts about Jesus, keep in mind that this cuts both ways. I have all kinds of feelings about atheism. Now, there's other evidence that's relevant to this discussion, and I'm sure that much of it will come out in the course of this debate. But we already have enough to conclude that Jesus died by crucifixion, that he was alive again later, that friends and foes were so thoroughly convinced that Jesus had appeared to them that they were willing to endure torture and death for the privilege of proclaiming the Christian message. The question for us is, what happened? That's the question I had to struggle with 19 years ago. And I realized that apart from the resurrection, I couldn't come up with any explanation that fit the facts. By that time, I already knew that naturalism was a theory in crisis, and I didn't trust my feelings enough to deny evidence based on them. In the end, I concluded that Jesus of Nazareth rose from the dead, and that if I'm going to listen to anyone tell me about God, it's him.
Excellent. So I just want to highlight the fact that it's just really excellent opening statement. I think you made a powerful case. I am going to move into a couple of other evidences that I have. I'm preparing for a debate with Mr. Majors, and but I'm just going to offer a few of the things that I think are pretty important. So let me just go back to, okay, so here's something that I would like to start with here. So the reliability of the Gospels, one of the things that's going to come up later in this debate is this idea of non-reliability of the Gospels. So hold on, I just realized my screen's not sharing. 1 second here. Here we go. Okay. All right, so some support for the reliability of the Gospels comes actually from a very interesting place. It comes from Bart Ehrman. Bart Ehrman is a professed agnostic. He's written a number of books against Jesus, and he points out the fact that he and his mentor, Bruce Metzger, the late Bruce Metzger, both agree on some really important things. He says, Bruce Metzger is one of the great scholars of modern times, and I dedicated the book to him because he was both my inspiration for going into textual criticism and the person who trained me in the field. And even though we may disagree on important religious questions, he is a firmly committed Christian and I am not. We are in complete agreement on a number of very important historical and textual questions. If he and I were put in a room and asked to hammer out a consensus statement on what we think the original text of the New Testament probably looked like, there would be very few points of disagreement, maybe 1 or 2 dozen places out of many thousands. The position I argue for in misquoting Jesus does not actually stand at odds with Professor Metzger's position that the essential Christian beliefs are not affected by textual variants in the manuscript tradition of the New Testament. This is a key point. Just think about this. So the core tenets of Christianity, which is basically steeped in the idea of Jesus' resurrection, these have been retained. So anyone who tries to say that the Gospels are not credible, they're not reliable, we even have Bart Ehrman giving us some support. Now, we also have support for this idea of the suffering servant. So many people like to talk about Isaiah 53, and people in this crowd right now, I'm sure you're aware of Isaiah 53, where it says things such as, he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. He basically is the suffering servant. And so people try to say, how do we support the suffering servant? Well, actually, if you go into the Bible, you can find more evidence of this idea of the suffering servant. So we've got in Isaiah a number of different points, and some of these were made recently by Jonathan McClatchy on my channel, and I highlighted them in a recent video from yesterday, but I wanted to put these in writing and put these in front of you because I think these are great. So we have Isaiah 2, says, come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the temple of the God of Jacob. He will teach us his ways so that we may walk in his paths. The law will go out from Zion, the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. He will judge between the nations and will settle disputes for many peoples. Okay, so we have this idea of the being taught, and the law is going to go out from Zion, the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. So we know that the Jerusalem is considered a very special place. Isaiah 7:14 predicted Jesus coming here of a virgin. So it said, therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. The virgin will conceive and give birth to a son and will call him Emmanuel. And Emmanuel means God with us. We also have Isaiah 9:6-7 saying, for to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government will be on his shoulders. And he will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the greatness of his government and peace there will be no end. He will reign on David's throne and over his kingdom, establishing and upholding it with justice and righteousness from that time on and forever. The zeal of the Lord Almighty will accomplish this. Okay, and so we have some evidence here that there is going to be a son who is born, and this is the type of person he would be. This is a clear reference to Jesus. We also have from Isaiah 11:1-5, a shoot will come up from the stump of Jesse. Now, just remember, in Isaiah 53, it also uses the same word to describe the shoot. A shoot will come up from the stump of Jesse, and of course, Jesus is in Jesse's bloodline. From his roots, a branch will bear fruit. The Spirit of the Lord will rest on him, the Spirit of wisdom and of understanding, the Spirit of counsel and of might, the Spirit of the knowledge and fear of the Lord, and he will delight in the fear of the Lord. He will not judge by what he sees with his eyes or decide by what he hears with his ears, but with righteousness he will judge the needy. With justice he will give decisions for the poor of the earth. He will strike the earth with the rod of his mouth, with the breath of his lips. He will slay the wicked. Righteousness will be his belt, and faithfulness the sash around his waist. Then we also have Isaiah 47:4. Our Redeemer, the Lord Almighty is his name, is the Holy One of Israel. Okay, so not the nation of Israel. One of the big arguments with the suffering servant is people say that the suffering servant refers to the nation of Israel or the people of Israel. But we already know in the Bible, Israel was constantly sinning. And throughout the entire Old Testament, there are references to Israel basically doing the wrong thing. And so we have lots and lots of evidence of Israel constantly sinning. And we also have this Holy One who is going to be of Israel. And that's the reference to the suffering servant. In Isaiah 48:17, it said, this is what the Lord says, your Redeemer, the Holy One of Israel. I am the Lord your God who teaches you what is best for you, who directs you in the way you should go. So then we also have more support. We have support from Isaiah 49. He said to me, you are my servant, Israel, in whom I will display my splendor. But I said, I have labored in pain or in vain. I have spent my strength for nothing at all. Yet what is due me in the Lord's hand, and my reward is with my God. And now the Lord says, he who formed me in the womb to be his servant, to bring Jacob back to him and to gather Israel to himself. So you see right here, the suffering servant cannot also be Israel if he's going to gather Israel to himself. It wouldn't make sense to say that the suffering servant is also Israel, which is gathering Israel. That's a circular argument. For I am honored in the eyes of the Lord, and my God has been my strength. He says, is it too small a thing for you to be my servant, to restore the tribes of Jacob and bring back those of Israel I have kept? I will also make you a light for the Gentiles, that my salvation may reach to the ends of the earth. This is what the Lord says, the Redeemer and Holy One of Israel, to him who was despised and abhorred by the nation, to the servant of rulers. Kings will see you and stand up. Princes will see and bow down because of the Lord, who is faithful, the Holy One of Israel, who has chosen you. Now, there's a few things to make note to this. Jesus did end up coming, and he was rejected by his own people, as noted in the book of Isaiah 53. But you'll also note that this idea of being a light to the Gentiles, we know from evidence, especially with the work and ministry of Paul, that Jesus and Christianity was a light to the Gentiles, and many Gentiles accepted Christianity. And I'm an example of a Gentile who accepts Christianity. And there are, hundreds of thousands, if not millions. Actually, now that I think about it, we have over 2 billion people on the planet following Christianity. And so it's really interesting that his salvation has reached the ends of the earth. Consider the fact that Christianity is the only major world religion that has spread virtually to every single place on the planet and is not centered in the same hub in which it originated. Okay, so Christianity right now moved over to Europe and in Western countries. It moved into Australia, New Zealand, the United States, Canada, all through South America. We have Christianity has spread everywhere. It's all over the world, and it is the most practiced religion. And over the centuries, if you go back to Tom Holland's book on Dominion, you will see that this idea of kings and princes, they also came to accept Christianity. In fact, one of the ways that Christianity spread was the start through Constantine. So before Constantine had legally or had made Christianity legal, many people had persecuted Christians for the first few hundred years. They were not warriors like Muslims. They were basically very peaceful people. And Constantine in the year 313 decided to legalize Christianity. And so he was an example of an emperor who supported Christianity. And then we have many emperors who followed him through the centuries who ended up bowing down to Jesus. So this was predicted 700 years before Jesus even walked the earth in the book of Isaiah. Now in Isaiah 52:13-15, it said, see, my servant will act wisely. He will be raised and lifted up and highly exalted. Just as there were many who were appalled at him, his appearance was so disfigured beyond that of any human being, and his form marred beyond human likeness. So he will sprinkle many nations, and kings will shut their mouths because of him. For what they were not told, they will see, and what they have not heard, they will understand. So if you have the ears and the eyes to see and hear, you will be able to understand the suffering servant. And another thing that you can point out here is as David had described initially in his video, he talked about the crucifixion and how severely people were beaten even before they carried their cross. They were beaten with these devices that basically tore their skin. And so you can imagine what Jesus looked like and what Jesus went through. And for this reason, we could probably say why he was so pained when he was in the Garden of Gethsemane, before his crucifixion, because he was, he was basically bleeding from his pores. He was under so much stress. And of course, just knowing that this was going to happen to him, but not even the physical so much as the mental, because of course he loves all, and to see his own children doing things like this and spitting at him would certainly, of course, be very painful for Jesus. Now, just to point out some other support is this idea of what did the suffering servant come here for? And I love this, I'm going to borrow this from Robert Rowe. Robert Rowe is with Sentinel Apologetics, and I saw this on his Facebook page, and I really liked it. He said, if we needed an engineer, God would have sent an engineer. If we needed he said different things like that. He said, if we needed somebody to come and teach us about evolution, he would have sent somebody to come and teach us about evolution, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. If we needed a scientist, he would have sent a scientist. If we needed a biologist, he would have sent a biologist, whatever it is. However, what we needed was forgiveness. And so God sent the forgiver. And in Isaiah 57:19, it says, peace, peace to those far and near, says the Lord, and I will heal them. Okay, so God understood the fact that we're all sinners, all fall short of the glory of the God, and he sent Jesus to forgive us. And of course, the form of Jesus, now in the Talmud, which was written a few hundred years after Jesus, people had discussed two different types of Messiah in the Old Testament. And so they discussed the type of Messiah that would be a warrior king sort of a Messiah, coming in the clouds of heaven, sitting at the right hand of the Father. And that was referenced in, say, Daniel 7. And then we also see the example of the Messiah who is a very humble Messiah. And this was exemplified here in Zechariah 9:9. So Zechariah said, rejoice greatly, daughter Zion. Shout, daughter Jerusalem. See, your king comes to you, righteous and victorious, lowly and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey. And so we have a lot of evidence of the type of Messiah. So we had to first be forgiven from a healing Messiah and a forgiving Messiah prior to the final coming of the Messiah, which we will witness in the end times. And some people say, well, what about the end times? Are we in the end times now? Well, we could make a pretty good argument that within this 2,000-year period, this could all be considered the end times when you consider the fact that the earth is potentially 4.5 billion years old. If we have a 4.5 billion year planet and we've got a 2,000 years since Christianity, this could be considered in the same time period. And even if you look at the 7 days of the Bible, we know that we're in the seventh day. Essentially, God never went to rest. He's at rest and he's in the seventh day. That's the way that some people interpret Genesis. But this whole idea of this whole time after 2000. Now, I want to make another observation about that I think is important that you guys know. One of the things that I've heard atheists say is they say, well, geez, if humans have been walking this planet for a couple 100,000 years, why did Jesus wait all of those years, almost a couple 100,000 essentially, or 198,000 years or whatever it is? Why did he wait so long before coming to the planet? What about all of the people who lived before that? It might be interesting for you to note something that's really key. The Population Reference Bureau says that 108 billion people have walked the planet, and 57% of those walk the planet after the year 1 AD. That's very significant because if you consider that more people have walked the planet since Jesus Christ came at exactly the right time. And another argument that I've heard for the great reasoning behind the timing of Jesus's appearance is this whole idea that the roads were created at that point, so the apostles were actually able to get around pretty quickly to spread the good news because they had developed roadways at that point to get from cities to cities. And so it was easier for them to move about and to go about spreading the good news. So let me get out of this now. Okay, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to come back to David Wood. Hold on, I just realized I have to screen share again. So let's do that again. We're going to go back to David Wood because I want to show you the response here that he gets after that wonderful part of that debate. Okay, here we are. So let's hear what he has to say. Oops, wait, let me first make sure we get sound here. Yes, we do. Okay.
Thank you. And now we'll have a 20-minute opening statement by John.
Now, what we want to see in this particular opening statement is we should be seeing John looking at some of or actually making some specific assertions that are going to go against what David says. Now, he's got this opportunity. So let's see what John has to say, and I'll have commentary in just a minute. And if you guys want to comment, I'm looking at I am watching the live stream here, so I can always do that too. So here we go.
Don't start the timer yet.
I'm running the timer, so you're all right.
All right. David. I am literally stunned. Okay.
So what he's doing right now is immediately acting in a very condescending manner towards David. Let's just see what he says.
It would be nice. If that's all it takes for you to believe that somebody was raised from the dead.
Let's note in the first 150 years of Jesus' resurrection, we have no less than at least 42 different sources that have provided evidence supporting the New Testament. And in those 42 sources, there are 33 Christian sources, including biblical and extra-biblical sources, and 9 hostile witnesses to Christianity. So we have 9 extra-biblical sources within 150 years that support the New Testament and eliminate the possibility for a legend. And I'll name a few of them: Suetonius, Pliny the Younger, Josephus, Tacitus, Maro Bar Sapion. We just have a bunch. So we've got people outside of the Bible who are even hostile to Christianity supporting it. And what we have from this kind of thing is we also have, as David had pointed out, a number of different atheists and agnostics who said, okay, we have evidence of Jesus. We have evidence of his crucifixion, and we have evidence that the apostles and early disciples believe that they saw Jesus rise from the dead. Now, you can't get past that without accepting it. It's really quite simple, but let's see what he says.
Then you might just believe anything. You might believe that witches are empowered by the devil and think that.
So what he's doing right now is he's using a red herring approach. Let's keep going.
They should be killed. You might believe, based on the Bible, that slavery is okay. You might believe that people are going to go to heaven, and so when you're in the Crusades, not knowing which ones are true believers and which ones not, just say, well, kill them all and let God.
Okay, so what he's doing right now is also bringing up phony assertions from the Bible. Now, the Bible doesn't say that slavery is okay. Okay, so God regulated slavery in the same way that God regulated this idea of divorce, and he spoke of marriage. And so to claim that the Bible is saying slavery is just wonderful, that's just not the case. We also know in the Bible the way that Jesus treated everyone equally. All people were considered equal, and this was something that goes completely against the way that people were in ancient times. In fact, I see in the crowd here, Jesse Camping. I want to say thank you, Jesse. Jesse, actually, I would highly recommend you go and watch the video that he did on Lex Talionis, when he talks about the laws of retribution. And the whole idea back in ancient times is that people were unfairly and unequally treated. And Christianity was a welcome change from that, saying that all men are equal. And in the New Testament, Paul makes it very specific that neither slaves nor Jews nor Greeks, everyone's considered equal. Okay, and he referred to Onesimus, who was a slave, as a brother. And so we can see the kind of treatment that slaves are given. We should also make a quick note that slavery was eliminated based on Christians, such as Gregory, as an example. And ancient slavery was eliminated. The fights in the gladiatorial stadiums were eliminated because of Christians. And even in recent times in the United States and in Great Britain, major abolitionists who fought to end slavery in these places and in the islands and places such as those, people were Christian. They were doing that based on their faith and their belief in equality of all men. And so this is just something that we should all note. And so that's not a correct assertion. And also to go back to the Crusades and try to demonize modern Christianity from the bad acts of people in the past is another red herring.
Decide. All right, I'm sorry. I got to get on with my talk. I can't express to you how diametrically opposed we are in our views of things. So let me get on to what I've got to say. You want to put that up? Okay. Would you do that line by line, please? Okay. I want you to think in terms of never having heard about Jesus before, never having heard about Christianity before. Now, if you had had that in mind when he was talking, if you had that in mind the very first time when he stood up and said anything, the very first time he spoke a word, and you were evaluating his case based on never hearing about Jesus, never hearing about Christianity, you would have the same view of things as I do sitting here listening to that evidence.
One of the very interesting things is David Wood was an atheist for many years. In fact, he spent time in prison for having attempted to kill his own father. He's been diagnosed with something similar to either sociopathy or psychopathy. And so he has that behind him. He has atheism behind him. He points out later in this video that his wife was an agnostic when they got married, but they looked at the evidence for Christianity and made a reasoned belief. And in the Bible, it makes it very specific that we're not supposed to just believe blindly. We're supposed to test everything, and we're supposed to do that kind of stuff for Christianity. And the nice thing about Christianity is when you do these tests, more and more evidence just points to Christianity. And so that's just something to think about. Another thing is we don't want him to use the genetic fallacy. And the genetic fallacy basically says that just because you're born into a place where some practice is prevalent, that you will come to believe that practice, that's a fallacy. Because, for example, just because if I learned how to do algebra in a school and I said I came to know algebra from this time at my school, doesn't mean that algebra is, it's not probably a good example, maybe I should go back to that, but the idea of how you come to know something speaks to whether or not it's true is a faulty assertion. And so I can say that knowing whether or not algebra is a good system of math, it has nothing to do with whether I learned it in a school. I think that's what I meant to say. So going back to this whole idea of Christianity, a lot of people come to Christianity after having left the church, or maybe being raised, such as I was. So I was raised in the Catholic faith. I left the church for a couple decades, and Jesus brought me back. And the more I've been learning about him lately in the past 8 years, the stronger the relationship to Christianity has become, because the evidence is overwhelming, okay? So we have over 5,800 manuscripts, early Greek manuscripts. These manuscripts are all over the globe. We have lots of evidence in support of Christianity outside of the Bible. And so just start looking for it, friends, and you will learn as I did.
See, most of us are raised to believe what our parents taught us, or our uncles, or grandparents in a Christian culture mainly. And if you were raised in a Muslim culture, you would be taught differently. If you were raised in a Jewish culture, you'd be taught differently. If you were raised in a Hindu or a Buddhist culture, you would be raised to believe differently. And
so let me just point out a few examples of people. So Nabil Qureshi is an example of a person who was raised a Muslim, and when he started seeking Allah, he found Jesus. He's got a book called Seeking Allah, Finding Jesus. We have right now going on in a lot of Muslim countries many accounts of people saying that they have seen Jesus in their dreams. People who are not believing Jesus is the Son of God. They believe he's just a prophet at the level of Muhammad. They believe he wasn't crucified. They believe that God took him to heaven and somebody else took his place. Many of them believe that because of kind of a vague reference to Jesus' crucifixion in the Quran. And so Muslims have this sort of belief. And those who do seek God, if they seek knowledge, Jesus has made himself known to them. We also have examples of people such as Dr. Michael Brown, who was raised in the Jewish faith, but after he examined the evidence and he looked at passages such as those I just mentioned in Isaiah 53, he came to Christianity. In fact, a lot of Jews in the Jews for Jesus movement use Isaiah 53 and some of the prophecies in the Old Testament to paint a very good case for Jesus. And another one that you guys maybe don't know of, but might want to be aware of, is Daniel 9 makes a very specific prophecy of the timing of Jesus's arrival. And so Daniel 9 talks about 77s less 7, which is 483 years of the time when the decree went out to rebuild the temple. We can estimate a few times when that did occur, but one of the last time that it did occur would have been in 444 BC with Artaxerxes. And if you add up the 483 years using 360-day Jewish calendar, you'll land at the year 33, which coincidentally, it'll come out to the time when Jesus fulfilled Zechariah 9:9 and got on the donkey and rode into Jerusalem. So that timing was completely predicted. And that's maybe one of the reasons why Jesus didn't fully come out as the Messiah prior to going down into Jerusalem on the donkey, because prior to that in his ministry, he would ask people if they knew who he was, but he wasn't going around telling people who were not his apostles and that saying, hey, I am the Messiah. He instead would let people try to figure that out. And then he came out on his march into Jerusalem and made that very obvious. And that was in fulfillment of Daniel 9. So let's go.
And you would come to a debate like this, and you would hear someone defend your views, just like David did. And no matter what I said as an atheist, you would walk away and say, David just kicked butt tonight. I mean, if you were a Buddhist, you would do that. If you were a Hindu, you would do that. Because you were raised to believe a certain way, and you're looking for ways to support what you believe. You're not actually evaluating the evidence like you should.
So he's making a false assertion about the way people act. You don't come into something and constantly be, trying to pad the evidence that you have in support or against something. What you do is you try to have an open mind and to listen to both sides. Now, we're going to keep listening to his.
Dead people don't rise up from the dead unless there is an overwhelming, massive amount of evidence to show that they do. Okay. Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm just jolted once again by the lack of evidence here. And let me just go through that. Now, David wants us to believe, I want you to imagine David wants us to believe in Yingianity based on a guy named Ying, who he claims was resurrected in 4th century China. Now, you heard the statistics that 90% of the people in China think they were healed. When they are healed, they're healed supernaturally. So that would stand to reason that China would be a superstitious country. So you see what he just did right there? So we have 90% of people in China who came to Christianity, who converted, who made a very large life decision to convert to Christianity because they experienced some sort of a healing episode in the church, because the churches over there, as I mentioned, have a lot of healing episodes where people are being healed. He just said that everyone in China who is coming under this must be superstitious. Does that seem reasonable? Think about these healing situations that we've heard about. So in the crowd here, I did see Slam RN a little while ago. I don't know if she's still in here, but I think I saw her. Maybe I didn't see her. Let me just look back here. I want to point out something. There was a woman called Barbara Comiskey-Snyder. And Barbara Comiskey-Snyder, I've mentioned this a few other times, but she had a very specific miracle that cured her multiple sclerosis and got her out of a wheelchair and into walking. And there's a big story behind that, but it's just one piece of evidence. And certainly she is not superstitious. What happened was she was praying to Jesus and people were praying for her. And as that was happening at a radio station, apparently hundreds of people were praying for her. Suddenly she hears the words, "My child, get up and walk." Now, is she superstitious? Or is the fact that suddenly she was cured of her MS, and this is in 1981, and today is still MS-free, I think that points to a miraculous healing. And there's other evidences of that. Now, another one, as pointed out by David Wood, was mentioned by Craig Keener, who's collected 2 volumes of miracles all around the world. And we also have the Pew study, as mentioned by David, that 200 million people have said that they have witnessed some sort of healing, and that has led them to Christianity. And so when you hear these things and just assume that these people are superstitious, that is making a huge faith claim on your own. Approach the evidence like that. I chose Yingianity on purpose because it sounds like Christianity. And based on 4th century documents that resemble Christianity in every way. Ying was raised from the dead. He is believed to have saved the world, from their sins. He died some horrific death. And he was prophesied based on some ancient text before that. And we recently found these documents. We recently found these texts in an archaeological dig somewhere. The religion, of course, has died out. And the reason why it died out is because some guy named Mao in Beijing conquered the land and rid itself of Yingianity. So it basically went out of existence, and he established a different religion in its place, not Ying.
I can't help but notice that he might be referring to Mao Zedong. And if he's referring to Mao Zedong ushered in atheism, which ended up killing millions and millions of people in China. He starved a number of them to death. So Mao Zedong also, this equates to something very similar that Stalin did in Russia and also what Pol Pot did in Cambodia. So we've got evidence that over 120 million people perished last century by this new religion called atheism. And it's actually communism. Okay, it's communism that ended up doing this. However, all three of those people were atheists who were trying to rid their countries of religion. And we have lots of evidence of that. And I've written blogs on it. I found support from the US government. I've got lots of different things like that. And so, yes, they were trying to rid their countries of religion. They would close down churches, burn people. And one of the things that was big back then is this idea of communism and starvation. And so if anyone thinks that communism is an appropriate way to run a government, you have something coming. We have the most bloody sort of form of government ever in the last century. In fact, people will say, well, what about religious wars and that sort of thing? Around all the wars and all of the different types of government and everything else that's caused bloodshed, Christianity and other religions have only caused about 7% of the deaths. And so you can go back, and I've got some figures on that from people like Greg Kukel, and Seigart's compiled some of that stuff in his book as well.
Christianity, but some other kind of religion. Now that's died out. And David's here, he's trying to convince us to believe in Ying and Yingianity based solely on 4th century documents. That is,
wait a second. So let's make a note of this. He's trying to make the claim that the documents that we're using to support Christianity are from the 4th century. He's completely ignoring 1 Corinthians 15 and the fact that the documents were not from the 4th century. The documents that we're using in support of Christianity are from long before that. Again, because we have the Bible, we have the gospel authors, we have what Paul wrote, and we also have a lot of early church fathers who duplicated a lot of the passages from that. And they did that in the 1st and 2nd century. We did a lot of that kind of stuff. A lot of the duplications of the passages from the Bibles were written down by other church fathers. And so we have early evidence and backups. And so making this claim that it's 4th century is completely, it's just not right. So
documents that are 4 centuries old. That's twice the length of time America has been in existence. Now let's just say we wanted to evaluate whether George Washington existed. And all we have are published results of, George Washington, when was this published? Well, 2015. What does it say he did? Well, he cut down a cherry tree. What else does it say that he was president of the United States? Well, what else? Well, he was married to Martha. What else? Well, where's the earlier sources? Well, we have little fragments here and there. Here's a little fragment here, But what did the surrounding fragments say? What did the surrounding documents say? Well, we're assuming it's the same as what we have, but we don't know. We can't say that. And you wouldn't have any reason to believe that George Washington didn't exist unless you could trace it back to earlier sources, especially if there were reasons for thinking that those texts were doctored up.
Now let's, again, just to remind you of something that I was posted a little while ago with what Bart Ehrman said, who's a textual critic. Even though he's an agnostic, he admitted that the core tenets of Christianity, that they believed in the resurrection, those have been captured in the Gospels as they appear today. So the Gospels are reliable, and they do give us evidence of Jesus' resurrection.
Okay, next. All right, now why am I asking you to do this? Why am I asking you to look at it differently? Because it's the only way to do things. It's the only way to actually evaluate the truth of your religion. Why? Because you were raised to believe this religion, weren't you? You were raised to believe as Christians. You know nothing else, most of you. You need to actually ask yourself what it would look like to be confronted with a Trinity as a Muslim, or a virgin birth as a Hindu. You need to ask yourself what it would be like to, for the very first time, hear of an incarnate God, as a Jew.
One of the really interesting things that you also might want to consider in this conversation here is he's using a lot of this can't be credible. This is something that can't be. But if you consider the fact that if we look at all the observable planets that people have seen with the Hubble telescope, we look at the thousands of planets, we look at the assessment of how many planets there are in this universe, there's only one planet that even comes close to having the number of habitable zones that the Earth has to provide accessibility to life, to advanced life as we know it. So there's one other planet in all of the thousands that people have observed that actually supports 2 habitable zones, but no other planets have the 10 habitable zones than we have. And there might even be more habitable zones. In fact, I think Hugh Ross has come up with some more habitable zones since I read his book on these sort of things. So that's just something to think about, because if you look out, I would say that this sounds something that atheists make fun of, but if you look outside your window and just look at the trees and the rainbows and the stars and the moon and all that kind of stuff, and you try to say that there is no divine force behind the cosmology of this whole thing, then I don't think you're really being reasonable, and you certainly must not have looked at the surfaces of other planets that we have witnessed and considered the fact that the Earth is very unique, where it's positioned within the Milky Way, the fact that the moon is a certain size, the fact that the moon has tidally locked, the fact that Jupiter is sort of a garbage can receptacle for the meteors that go by and other sort of asteroids and things that could hit the Earth. So there's a lot of things that have been positioned very well in the outer space that suggests that there is an intentional designer out there who has monkeyed with the numbers. And so you can just see that kind of thing. So even some of the people who've studied cosmology have come to believe in God based on the odds, the statistically miraculous odds, as Dyson, Cleveland, and Susskind have said, that Earth has overcome to be where we are in this galaxy. So here we go.
You need to ask yourself all these sorts of questions because they sound bizarre. I mean, they sound bizarre when you first hear them, but because you're familiar with them, that's the only difference. That's the only difference. You're familiar with them, and so therefore they have the ring of truth to them without the evidence. Now let me get to the evidence because that's an important thing. Okay, next slide. It's the best way to do that. Okay, next. Because we depend on familiarity, I mentioned that. We depend on our cultures, next thing. And we seek to confirm rather than disconfirm our beliefs. Next, please. Now, here's the kicker. One more time. It would take an overwhelming amount of strong historical evidence to overcome our concrete personal experience that dead men stay dead. Now, you've never seen anybody raised from the dead. And yet you believe somebody raised from the dead based on a 4th century manuscript?
He's not considering what the apostles said and what the apostles went through. So if you say that the agnostics and the atheists have all accepted the fact that the apostles have made the claim that they saw the risen Christ, so some of them have discounted that after that, but they've noted that the apostles said that. And then you have to consider the experience of the apostles. And so these men said that they saw the risen Christ, and for decades they preached for Christianity. And so one must ask why? Why would they do such a thing? They certainly didn't get any material wealth from it. They didn't get any sort of health benefits from it because they were being constantly flogged and whipped and stoned. They were put in prison quite a bit. They were starved. You can see the life of an apostle in those centuries was quite torturous. So why would they do what they did? They were in the unique position to know what they were doing was not a lie. They knew what they were doing was the truth, and that's one of the reasons why they were so persistent. So he can act as if this is incredulous, but really you have to look at it and you have to think, if God wanted to manifest himself on this planet to forgive man and release us from the binds that we had to sin, and he did it the way he did it, we through a savior, through the miraculous rising of a savior. Just to put it another way, one of the things that atheists like to say is they say, well, why would God send God to be killed? Why would God do something like that? And just consider the fact that we were bound on this earth to our sins. One of the things that Jesus did when he rose from the dead is he freed people from the shackles of sins. And that was a very important thing. And so just point this out. Why did he send Jesus to do that? Because Jesus was uniquely qualified. Okay, so you can't send someone who's sinner to free people from sin. It doesn't make any sense. He had to send someone who was blemish free. And for centuries prior to Jesus' arrival, one of the things that we noticed was the Passover lamb was always blemish free. And so the Passover lamb symbolized Jesus.
I just find that stunning, actually. I mean, I can't believe that. Next, please. Now, here's my argument. Now, you think I'm a radical. You think I'm angry. I'm not. I'm just nervous. Trust me, I'm just nervous. And I was just, really, trust me, I just am nervous. And I was stunned once again. I mean, I really was stunned. Even though I've participated in these debates for, more than a decade, to hear it all over again, it's just, okay. I'm not mad. I'm a really good guy, I was just stunned, okay? Okay, I'm sure he's stunned at my views too, so I'll say that for him, right? I'll say that for him as well.
The funny thing is these two debated before, and I'm sure John Loftus has watched David Wood's channel, and why would he be stunned? It seems kind of silly.
My argument is this. Go ahead, click through these. Even if God exists, next. Even if miracles are possible, next. Even if Yingianity is true, next. Even if Ying was resurrected, stop. Even if there were eyewitnesses, there is no reason for us to believe that Ying was raised from the dead.
This is ludicrous, right? So he's just saying, even if God exists, okay, even if God exists, even if miracles are possible, and of course David has provided evidence that people have claimed that miracles are possible, even if Christianity, we'll just change that name because that's what he's really talking about, is true, even if Jesus resurrected, even if there were eyewitnesses, he still would not believe. You can't take it to the highest level of skepticism. This is just telling us what's going on in this man's mind. He is repressing the information. Even if we provide true information to him, he still won't believe. Now, this reminds me of Matt Dillahunty, because Matt Dillahunty does something very similar, is people said, well, even if even if there were words written up in the sky that said, I am Jesus, believe in me, or something like that, in a couple of different languages, Matt would still not believe. He would find a reason not to believe that sort of thing. So you can't show some of these people that Christianity is the truth because they have emotional reasons against it. Okay, there's only the only explanation for someone who would look at all of this stuff that he's listed right here and to say that even if all of this information is given to him, he's still not going to believe. Okay, do you get that? That's the epitome of massive skepticism.
China in 33 AD based on 4th century manuscripts. All of the evidence for Ying's resurrection are based on those writings that we have only as 4th century documents. You say, well,
again, he's completely ignored 1 Corinthians 15. I just want to highlight that again, okay, because that was a key point from David. Also, just notice that the work from Paul was written before he was beheaded. He was beheaded by Nero. They estimate somewhere between 62 and 64. So we know that. We also know that the work of Luke in the book of Acts only mentions 2 martyrdoms, okay? And Peter and Paul were sort of the stars of the book of Acts, so it seems reasonable. We know that Luke came prior to Acts because Luke spelled that out when he wrote his letters to Theophilus, and he talked about Theophilus. But we also know in the book of Acts, because they only mentioned Stephen and James, another apostle, and they didn't mention the deaths of the stars of the book of Acts, of Peter and Paul, one would make the assumption that the book of Acts was written prior to Peter's crucifixion, because Peter was hung upside down, according to a number of different sources. And so we would have to make that assumption that these books were written prior to these martyrdoms. And so in other words, that would be prior to the 60s decade. Okay. And so now later in this whole debate, John Loftus is going to make a claim that Luke wasn't written until around 140 AD, which is sheer lunacy considering the content of the book of Acts. But we'll go on.
Well, people believed before the 4th century. Well, sure they did. Some of it, we don't know exactly what they believed. That's the point. We don't know exactly.
But we do know that between 5 and 6 million people were following Christianity, and that's according to a book such as, I've got it right in front of me, Jeffrey Walrose, 2008 Historical Atlas. He's got 40 different scholars from around universities all around the globe who have contributed to this particular book. And in the book, it mentions that between 5 and 6 million people were following Christianity prior to its legalization. And so for such a huge group to be following a person who had been crucified as a slave is momentous. It's something that speaks to the divinity of this cause.
Exactly what they believed. We don't know how many times those documents were messed with. We know that Josephus, and Dr. Wood would confirm this, Josephus was tampered with. We know that. We also know that the church tampered another document called the Donation of Constantine. That's where they said, it's a great way you can lie when nobody can catch you. But they documented that the Emperor Constantine gave the Vatican the land that it now sits on. And they forged the document. We know this now because of writing samples and how they, and samples of the parchment itself. So we know the church doctored things. We know this. There's just no reason, even if it's true, there's a lot of things that are true that we have no reason to believe. Like, there.
Did you hear what he just said? So even if it's true, there's a lot of things that are true that we have no reason to believe. What is wrong with this man? I mean, I'm serious. This is lunacy. Lunacy.
There might be a criminal in this audience. There might be somebody wanted by the law. I just threw that out here. Might be a serious crime. I'm not going to say it was you. Don't worry about that. But there might be a criminal in here of a serious crime, and no one suspects you did it because the evidence isn't there. It's like that. It might have happened, but there's not enough evidence to think it did. There might be somebody might be abducted by aliens. I believe that just about as much as I believe this to be sure. And someone might actually have been abducted by aliens. But there's not enough evidence for us to believe even if he was. That's my point. All right, that's 10 minutes. Let's go. Now here's the point. Where's the empirical evidence? Please, next. There is none. Next. Because the resurrection of Ying, or Jesus, supposedly happened in the ancient pre-scientific past in a lone part of the planet before investigative reporters, videos, and cell phones. I never shook his hand. I never held his body close to mine. I never.
Help. I mean, really. So one of the things that actually gives Christianity a lot of merit and support, number one, he's making an assumption, and a lot of people do this. They'll call it like Goat Herder's Book, and they'll call it things like that, and they'll refer to it as in the Iron Age or in the Stone Age or different sorts of ages. And one of the things that this is ridiculous is because it's making an assumption that humans were of less mental capacity then than they are now. And that's quite frankly not true. If you look back to some of the amazing writings of people such as Aristotle and Plato and Socrates, we can see that people had a very big intellect back then, some people. And of course, Marcus Aurelius, we've got other writings now, meditations, that show that people back then, in many cases, were quite intelligent. And so Pythagoras, we've just got different things like that. And so he's trying to allude to this idea that Christianity is this ancient goat herder's text, but yet if we go back and we look at it, that wouldn't be right. And so another thing just to mention is the simple fact that a man who, if you look at the fact that we have a condemned criminal, okay, Jesus didn't do anything wrong, but he was condemned to die as a criminal, treated like a slave and crucified. When such a belief system is able to basically take over the entire planet, one must understand that there must be some divine inspiration under this entire thing, because it's truly amazing the way that Christianity spread.
I never got kissed on the lips by him. I never took off his sandals. I wasn't there to hear his words. No cell phone did either. There's no empirical evidence Jesus or Yang raised from the dead. Next, please.
Okay, so we all do have evidence that Jesus raised from the dead. So we have the evidence, as I mentioned before, and within the ancient times. So we've got a lot of evidence that Jesus raised from the dead, and we've got the testimonies of his apostles from numerous sources that support that.
Where's the textual evidence? 4th century text. Just let that sink in. Next, please. They contain forgeries. The ending of the Gospel of Mark is one of them, and Mark's Gospel does not mention a resurrection.
That's incorrect. So if you go back and you look at Mark 16:5, the passages that are contested start at Mark 16:9. Mark 16:5, the women show up at the tomb. The women encounter an angel. The angel says, quote, "He is not here, he is risen." Okay, that is the resurrection. And of course, he's going to ignore that. Another thing that you might want to note is in Mark 14:62. So he tries to make the assertion in this debate that Mark is the earliest and that the other gospels built upon Mark and added things. And so just go back to Mark 14:62 if you're interested to see what Mark really said. Mark 14:62 made a direct reference to Daniel 7. And what it was when Jesus was in front of the Pharisees who were accusing him of blasphemy, he basically referred to himself as, and you will see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven and sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One. The reason why this is very notable is because this specific line is exactly what was the reason for Jesus' crucifixion. Okay, it's blasphemy according to the Pharisees. They said it was complete blasphemy. What he said was reason for crucifixion, and that is the reason why he was crucified. Now, why did they go after someone like Jesus, who was just the son of a carpenter, was humble, was poor, that sort of thing? Why did they go after him, and why did they free Barabbas over Jesus? Is because he had threatened their ministry. And the reason he threatened their ministry was because he was going around performing miracles. Now, these miracles have been documented extra biblically. Okay, in case you're wondering, these miracles have been documented. So by people, including in the Jewish Talmud. So we have, he was a miracle worker, he was a wonder worker, he was performing miracles in Egypt, written outside of the Bible. And so we do have support for that, and that posed a huge threat to the Pharisees.
Why when David was quoting Matthew earlier, the very first text he put up there, he had to quote from Matthew on the resurrection, because Mark never mentioned it. And neither is it mentioned in Q, the document some scholars think predated the Gospel of Mark.
We don't even have Q, okay? There are people guessing that there is a Q which has some sayings in it. We don't have any evidence or record for Q, so to make any assertions about Q is rather silly.
The resurrection of Jesus was not mentioned in either Q or Mark. It waited till Matthew to be mentioned. Next, please. No reliable external evidence to date these texts. You know, scholars are debating whether the Gospels were written in the 50 AD or as much as late as 140 AD. Luke Gospel has been dated to 140 AD. They can't date them because there's not enough evidence to know when they were dated. Well, that's like Yang's text in the 4th century in China, too. You can't date them, not very well. So how do you know how long they've been around to be doctored up? Please, next. And it excludes other early Gospels. There's all kinds of Gospels. Gospels of Peter, Gospel of Judas. I think there's a Gospel of Mary.
Now, these are, of course, the Gospels that were written in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. These Gospels were way far away from the time of Jesus. And one of the reasons why the church did not include those Gospels in the overall canon was because they were not authentic and they were not written by either eyewitnesses or people who were witnesses to the eyewitnesses. And so we have, just note that we have Matthew and John were apostles of Jesus, so they were also eyewitnesses to his ministry. We have Luke, who had taken great strides to do an orderly account as he recorded himself, and he wanted to do one that was chronologically ordered, it sounds like. So Luke put his stuff together based on his interviews with people. Please note that Luke also referred to himself in the first person when he traveled with Paul starting in Acts 16. So Luke was claiming that he was there at the time while he was writing Acts, referring to himself in the first person. So again, when we have Luke traveling with Paul and Paul dying around the year 62 or 64, we can speak to earlier dating, okay? And so one of the reasons why they didn't include these later texts is because, again, they weren't considered reliable. And the church fathers went to great lengths to ensure the reliability of the words that they put together. Now, Mark, also just to note, Mark was a good friend of Peter. Okay, so Mark was also referenced a few times by Paul. So Mark had met Paul, Mark had met Peter. We've got those connections there. So we have people in the Gospels and in the New Testament who had all had experiences with Jesus. And there, in fact, I can't think of any one of them who did not have experiences with Jesus. The author of Hebrews, we're not sure who it was, but we have people, actually, Lydia McGrew has a pretty interesting speculation that it could have been a woman who authored Hebrews, and maybe that's the reason why they didn't give it the title, because women, again, were sort of treated as second-class citizens, and they wanted credibility among males and females back in that time. And so so that might have been one of the things that was going on. So here we go.
Now, who chose to put these things in the Bible? Well, the church did. And why not the Gnostic church? Why didn't the Gnostic church get to decide our Bible? There was a Gnostic church. They didn't believe Jesus was a fleshly being. It's because the Catholic Church won the day. And when you win the day, you get to select a text that supports your views. It's true. And you can even doctor those texts. As Bart Ehrman, he quoted earlier, shows us, they changed vowels, they changed letters, they changed words, they changed sentences, they changed text, they inserted text. Some of the documents in your Bible, like...
Just make a note exactly what Bart Ehrman said. So if we had no books, okay, if we only had the books by Paul, or if we only had one book by Peter, or if we only had one book by Mark, even if we only had that kind of stuff, we have overwhelming support for Christianity and for the resurrection. The resurrection is the foundation, and Bart even admitted that the core tenets are reliable. The Bibles that we have today are reliable assessments of what was said in ancient times. So even though Bart will try to make a mountain out of a molehill, literally, he does, well, I guess it's not quite literally, but he makes a mountain out of a molehill by trying to focus on one little obscure passage and trying to claim that the Gospels are unreliable based on some obscure passage. Like, for example, saying that the very ending of Mark was added on later. We don't know why the particular ending of Mark was added on later. If it were added on later, that even it's in our Gospels. When we read the Gospels, they always italicize that portion and they say that this could have been added later, but it's not material to what's in the text. Okay, so it's not something that contradicts anything that's later appearing in the other three Gospels. So
First, Second Timothy, Titus, 2 Peter, and 2 Thessalonians are forgeries.
now it's a claim that they're forgeries.
They're in there, though, because they didn't know how to determine truth from falsehood. Next, please. Where's the prophetic evidence? There is none. Now, here's going to surprise you. Here's going to surprise you. And this might be the debate. Now, there are some Jews, believers in Judaism here in the audience today. And they would verify this for me. There is no prophetic evidence that singularly points to Jesus as the Messiah from the Old Testament. None. Please. There's no prophecy of a Trinitarian God. Next. No prophecy of an incarnation. None. Next. No prophecy of a virgin birth. Next. And no prophecy of a dying
That's
Messiah.
completely wrong, and let's go over why this is wrong. So we are going to note in the book of Genesis, in the very first few paragraphs, God refers to himself as we, okay? He doesn't refer to himself as I. In the beginning, he refers to the God unit as a we. So we know that God is plural. In fact, the word Elohim is a plural word, okay? And so that speaks to this idea of one, three persons within one, okay? And then we have the idea of the incarnation. And the virgin birth. So we've got this whole idea of through the suffering servant. We saw, as I went through just a little while ago, the entire book of Isaiah points to the incarnation throughout. The virgin birth was referred to in 7:14, okay, Isaiah 7:14. And we also have the virgin birth is something that we call a seed of a woman in the book of Genesis. So the idea of most people, actually all people come from the seed of a man. So we came from, Jesus came from the seed of a woman. So we also have that verified in Genesis. This idea of no prophecy of a dying Messiah is baloney. Go to the book of Daniel, look at Daniel 9, and you're going to notice when they talk about the anointed one being cut off, that's the idea of the anointed one cut off is the Messiah, okay? And so also go ahead and take a look at Isaiah 53. We again see the reference to a dying, suffering servant, okay? So we also see the way that he was treated. And so just make these notes. These are really important.
You're going to quote Isaiah 53 to me, but that was clearly about Israel itself. Look at Isaiah chapter 49, verse 3. Next.
Okay, that was not clearly about Israel itself. It doesn't even make sense that it would be about Israel because basically the idea is he had done no sin. Now, clearly you can't say that Israel as a country or as peoples have done no sin when the Bible makes it quite explicit that everyone has fallen short of the glory of God. So when we have somebody in Isaiah 53 saying he had done no sin, clearly we can't be going after the nation of Israel. Also, it said he was nothing special to look at, something similar to that. We can't say that the nation of Israel does not have beautiful parts, okay, or is not very beautiful in some ways, and so, or the people of Israel. So we also have a couple of other reasons why we're not referring to the nation of Israel in Isaiah. Now, let's make a note that the Jewish people originally, even in the Talmud, had referred to the two different types of Messiah who would be coming. They even referred to the timing of the Messiah. And they realized that the timing led up to when Jesus did appear, and some of them still wanted to deny Jesus. And so they just basically said at that point that, oh, well, let's just go ahead and deny, let's just say that we must have been bad, so Jesus never, or the Messiah never came. But this whole idea of Isaiah 53 suddenly being called the nation of Israel, it was whispered about every so often in ancient times, but then we have Rashi around the year 1000 really adding cement to that, realizing that Christian missionaries were converting people based on Isaiah 53. It's a really important passage in the Old Testament.
And no prophecy of a resurrection. This he'll agree with me about. That one, last one, he'll agree with me. There's no prophecy of a resurrection. And it seems to me that I'm going to get to what happened in a minute. Next, please. Where's the first-hand testimonial evidence? There is none. What you have is 4th century documents. Next, please. No eyewitnesses wrote anything. He'll verify that.
No, we do have eyewitnesses who wrote things. So we have Matthew, we have Peter, we have Jude, we have James, and we also have John. So we definitely have eyewitnesses. And of course, Paul said in 1 Corinthians 15 that he witnessed Jesus too, and he wrote between 6 and 13 books of the New Testament. Now let's note some of the prophecies that Jesus fulfilled, and I'm just going to mention a couple of these really quickly. From the seed of a woman is Genesis 3:15. From the seed of Abraham is Genesis 1:2-7. From the tribe of Judah is Genesis 49:10. From the line of David is Jeremiah 23:5-6. He's both God and man, referred to in Isaiah 9:6-7. Born in Bethlehem, according to Micah 5:2. He preceded by a messenger and will visit Jerusalem temple in Malachi 3:1. And it had to occur before the temple was destroyed in the year 70. He was pierced for our transgressions in Isaiah 53. He cried out to the Lord in anguish, and he drew our attention when he did that to Psalm 22. And so we have a lot of evidence right there for Jesus. And so I'm going to mention something else that William Lane Craig said. So William Lane Craig said, it is of course indisputable that the New Testament church regarded Jesus as the promised Messiah. The title Christos, Messiah, became so closely connected with the name Jesus that for Paul it is practically a surname, Jesus Christ. Compare with the less frequent Christ Jesus. The very name borne by followers of Jesus within 10 years of his death, Christians, bears witness to the certainty of their beliefs that Jesus was the Messiah. Mark's gospel opens with the words, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, just as John's gospel closes with the explanation that it was written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, in 20:31. The question then is whether they arrived at this common conviction on their own, or did it represent Jesus' own self-understanding? Now, C.S. Lewis can provide an answer to that. In his Liar, Lunatic, and Lord argument, he said, a man who was merely a man and said the sort of things Jesus said would not be a great moral teacher. He would either be a lunatic on a level with a man who says he is a poached egg, or else he would be the devil of hell. You must make your choice. Either this man was and is the Son of God, or else a madman or something worse. You can shut him up for a fool, you can spit at him and kill him as a demon, or you can fall at his feet and call him Lord and God, but let us not come with any patronizing nonsense about his being a great human teacher. He has not left that open to us. He did not intend to.
That's true. No eyewitness. Jesus didn't. But Paul didn't actually see. He says he saw something. Okay, we'd have to dispute that. But the gospel writers, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John, they were not eyewitnesses. We know this. Those are names attached to gospels written later. Some scholars think that
zero ancient support for any attributions to anybody else other than the 4, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Okay, so just note that. We also have the church fathers, Tertullian, we've got Justin Martyr, we've got other church fathers who have referred to the Gospels, and they've also, in some cases, Origen and other church fathers have referred to, and Dionysius of Corinth. We've got a lot of different people who've referred to the Gospels. There's not a single attribution to other authors than Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So to make this assertion is just showing the bias on John Loftus' side.
Matthew was written by a school called the Matthew School, and that was probably around 70, 80 AD. That's really a long time away from eyewitnesses. Next, please. We don't have a chance to question them. We can't question Herod. We can't question Ananias, Caiaphas. We don't have a chance to look, what you want to do when you examine Mormonism is you want to be able to investigate the people who said, we saw this or we didn't see this. They say, well, we saw the golden plates, we didn't, but if we ask them, what did you actually see? Let's put you on a microscope and let's put you on a stand and ask you all kinds of investigative journalist questions. We're going to find some inconsistencies and problems. We can't do that with the New Testament. We can't do that with the apostles. And he might point to 1 Corinthians 15 only once, but it says nothing about what they saw, if they saw anything. I mean, Paul says they did. But it says nothing about what they saw. What if they had discrepancies among their stories?
He's just going down this rabbit trail, but it's not. When you go back to 1 Corinthians 15, Paul also points out that these other people were around to disqualify him. Okay, so the people, some were still awake, some were still alive, according to him, and they could certainly have disqualified his message and written against it if Paul were lying. But instead, he's pointing out to Jesus appearing to individuals at different times over a 40-day period and to 500 people in total at one time. So we've got lots of evidence of Jesus appearing to individuals and groups over time. And now John Loftus is trying to taint the well there.
We saw a ghost. In the Gospel of Luke, it says that Jesus was seen like a ghost. What did they see? I mean, you're saying they all have the same testimony, but do they? Next, please. It contains discrepancies. When did they arrive at the tomb? What time of the day? Who rolled the stone away? Actually, Luke disputes Matthew. Matthew says that the guard at the tomb was placed there to guard so that nobody would be able to steal the body. And then Luke comes along. He says, I've investigated everything, and I want to write down most orderly what actually happened. He says that in the first chapter, the first 3 verses. He says, I'm going to write down what exactly happened. And he left out the story of the guard at the tomb.
So this is an argument from silence. If you go back to any history book, if one historian includes some information, another historian includes different information, different people have different accounts of what they experienced. The fact that Luke did not include certain stories and Matthew included other stories or Mark included certain stories, it doesn't speak to whether or not the stories are true. What that speaks to is the importance that the author placed on the particular stories, and maybe the fact that the story was already out through another author, so they didn't feel they needed to repeat it. Okay, so the 4 accounts of the resurrection are all mentioned in the 4 books because that is the most important part of Christianity. Some of these tangential stories might not be mentioned in all 4 books because maybe they weren't given preeminent importance. And the other thing is to speak to is how expensive it was back in those days to be able to make a manuscript. You had to use a scroll, parchment, and it was a very expensive process. And so they probably weren't able to just write down everything. In fact, even at the end of the book of the book of John, he points out that Jesus told them all sorts of things, but he would just be recording a certain portion of them.
That means, folks, Luke didn't agree with Matthew's story of the guard at the tomb. It doesn't make sense anyway.
No, that doesn't
Next,
mean
please.
that. That means that Luke didn't put the story in the book. It doesn't mean that he didn't agree with it.
Shows evolutionary growth. The stone becomes a big stone, then becomes a new stone, then becomes a heavy stone. The other things like that. Next. Right. Don't forget the last one. Visionaries. Like the Mormons, like the growth of the Mormon church, it started with the people who saw visions. There's a different kind of...
Let's note one thing. Okay, the Mormon church is still centered in Utah. It's in the United States, essentially. It's a little bit around the world, but it's in the United States. 1.6% of Americans are Mormons. But let's also note that the early people who supported Joseph Smith, many of them recanted their testimonies, and that is dissimilar to Christianity. And Joseph made a claim on golden plates. The golden plates weren't witnessed, but our Christianity had multiple adherents, multiple supports, and so it is a different religion.
People that we don't understand. They're superstitious people. They have dreams, and they see things, or they think they see things, and these are people. Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians that he learned about the Lord's Supper from a vision. He also says in Galatians 1 that he did not receive 1 Corinthians 15. He says, I did not receive any tradition from those early apostles. So that is either a contradiction or we've got to go through that. And the first 2 chapters of Revelation, the book of Revelation, the revelator, John, says he heard a vision from on high, Jesus. Jesus was talking to him, and he dictates 7 letters to the 7 churches. Now, who among us would actually believe someone who said, I heard a vision, I saw a vision, and Jesus was talking to me, and I wrote down 7 letters to 7 churches in this area, and sent them by horseback if you want. And here, you can have your letter from Jesus, because of my vision, and here you can, and you're the lukewarm church. Not you, but you over there, you're the lukewarm church. And I had this vision, you see, and Jesus said he's going to spit you out of your mouth. Here, and would you really accept that? Well, these are visionaries, folks, and these are visionaries. Visionaries have the ability to see things that didn't happen, and you're calling them good witnesses? Next, please. Where's the corroborative evidence? None.
Complete lunacy. We have lots of corroborative evidence. As I mentioned before, we have many sources, 42 over the first 150 years. So this is, again, a false assertion.
Where's the corroborative evidence that there was an earthquake or that there was an eclipse?
Okay, I actually found corroborative evidence that there was an earthquake at this time based on some seismic information from some of the, from Jerusalem, actually. And so I found it in academic journals today when they actually traced back the timing of earthquakes that have occurred in the ancient Near East. And they found that there was an earthquake that occurred in the year 33. And so I will link to that blog because I've written a blog on it. I've also got it in my book that I'm working on. But I will link that because we do have evidence from looking at seismites in the basin, in these different basins, these waterways over in Jerusalem. So we've got evidence of an earthquake in the year 33. We don't have specific evidence on which day in the year 33, but we, of course, have the Bible saying that it occurred on basically what would have been April 3rd of 33.
Or that the saints came out of the tombs and roamed the streets of Jerusalem as Jesus was resurrected from the dead. No account of it at all. Oh, I'm sorry, Philo must have missed that. You see, Philo lived and worked and rode through the lands of Palestine.
Now, this is another argument from silence, so.
He didn't record any of that. Really, the saints, David, Solomon, the prophet Elijah, Isaiah, roaming the streets, and Philo never makes a mention of it. Now, David's friend Michael Licona doesn't believe that happened. And I support that. I agree with him on that. But it makes the whole story incredible. Just think if you're interviewing somebody to know whether to put them on a stand in a trial, and the person breaks out and says, I see Jesus up there, or I see blood on the wall, or I see something incredibly crazy, or I feel like ants are crawling all up my body. It discredits the entire testimony to find that in the Gospel of Matthew. Next, please.
No, it doesn't discount the entire. Now, there's different ways to look at the portion in the book of Matthew when they talk about the spirits coming up from the dead, essentially. And so it's our belief as Christians that Jesus was essentially unleashed people from the dead, people who had been chained to their sins in binds on this earth. So he unleashed people from the dead. And that was something that was also mentioned in the book of Isaiah. We could expect that that sort of thing would occur. However, because there is something in that book that can be taken different ways, as he mentioned, Mike Licona has his interpretation of that particular passage. Some people feel like it's more metaphorical. Whatever it is, it doesn't discredit the entire book because one passage is something that somebody finds incredible.
I mentioned those a little bit. Yeah, next.
Okay, so just also note, he just said pre-scientific superstitious era. So he is trying to pretend that people were all superstitious non-skeptics back then. But we even have evidence from the Gospels of the skepticism of the apostles themselves. Okay, Peter was very skeptical. Peter was denying Jesus a few times. They were not exactly sure. They were in hiding. Obviously, they must have been skeptical in that they were hiding during Jesus' crucifixion. And so we have that kind of evidence.
Next. Done. Jews. Final argument. There were 8 million Jews in the time of Jesus. And according to Catholic biblical scholar David Sim, who looked at the evidence and the censuses that were taken of those days and eras and what were written about the numbers of Jews that were at the time, 8 million of them, 7 million living in the known world, 2.5 million living in Palestine. They were beloved of God. They believed in God. You can't call them atheists, you see. Woo! Got that off our backs. They believed in miracles. They believed in all the miracles of the Old Testament.
So let's build on what he's saying here. Let's also make a realization that the apostles were Jewish, okay? The apostles were Jewish. They came to believe in Jesus. Jesus' brother and family were all Jewish. They came to believe in Jesus. Paul was persecuting Christians as Saul. He was Jewish, okay? So we've got examples. And then we have all throughout the book of Acts and into the epistles, we have examples of the early churches where people were going into the synagogues and the church buildings, essentially, and they were converting people based on what was going on in the Old Testament. So one of the really great examples that people might not be aware of is when there was a person who was traveling on a road and another person was kind of given a hint from God to go approach this person, and the person was traveling on the road and the person was reading the passage that equated to Isaiah 53 and said, who does this describe? and it was made clear that that described Jesus. Now, a lot of people who believed in Judaism didn't initially have their eyes open. They didn't initially see the passages in the Old Testament that corresponded to Jesus. But on the road to Emmaus, we see that whole thing played out. So people had different expectations of who the Messiah would be. There were two different types of Messiah reported in the Old Testament, and this was also written in the Talmud, that they realized that there were two different types of Messiah. One Messiah, according to the Talmud, would be riding on an ass. That's the quote. So we have that kind of thing. And so this sort of plays out where he's discounting the fact that the earliest followers of Christianity were Jewish people.
They hoped for a Messiah. They knew their Old Testament prophecies, but they didn't believe. A lot of them. Now, you can claim they got their Old Testament prophecies wrong all you want, but then who wrote them? Who supposedly inspired them? Who predicted the events, whatever they were? That would mean that God purposely misled them. Their choices are, the Jews, 8 million of them, 2.5 living in the area, were incredibly stupid people. Not to know their prophecies. Incredibly evil people, not wanting to believe their prophecies, or that God misled them about the prophecies. I already said there was no prophecy about a resurrection, right? There isn't. Well, that would mean he condemned them to hell, too.
Isaiah 53 says he would see the light of day. Of course, that does refer to the resurrection. But God in the Old Testament, some of the prophecies are a little bit vague. And one of the reasons probably was because Satan was busy reading the Old Testament too. I'm not kidding around there. Satan knew his Old Testament. He was the one who was trying to use it against Jesus when he confronted him on the Mount. And so we have that sort of thing. So some of the stuff might have been kept deliberately vague, slightly vague, but now that you look at it, and when your eyes have been opened and you have the ears to hear, you can see the very specific prophecies of Jesus all throughout the Old Testament. There's 330 of them, by the way, that were fulfilled.
And to all of the problems that they've suffered at the hands of Christians who view them as Christ killers. If one more, please. Would you believe in Yingianity with this non-evidence if it was defended by Ying apologists, where 80% of them rejected the sufficiency of historical evidence? There's a first part of this presentation I didn't go into, and I talk about apologetical methods, and I'm done. But 80% of Christian apologists reject the evidential method of apologetics in favor of classical apologetics or presuppositionalism. Or faithism or something like that. So 80% of Christians reject the sufficiency of historical evidence, and these are the reasons why. Sorry if I was a little nervous, but I was just, okay, thank you, bye.
Okay, so I just want to point out 80% of Christians reject historical evidence. That just is, come on. We have a lot of historical evidence in support of Christianity, and we actually have just looking at the story itself. If we just went to the outside of the Bible, in fact, let me show you something here. Hold on one second. Let me just show you something that's really important here. Hold on. Okay, now I've got it to where I want it to be. Okay, this is my slide deck from a debate I'm going to be doing soon. Okay, so just to point out something that we know from extra biblical sources. We know that Jesus lived during the time of Tiberius Caesar. He lived a virtuous life. He was a wonder worker. He had a brother named James. He was acclaimed to be the Messiah, who was crucified under Pontius Pilate. An eclipse, an earthquake occurred when he died. He was crucified on the eve of the Jewish Passover. His disciples believed he rose from the dead. They were willing to die for their belief. Christianity spread as rapidly as far as Rome, and his disciples denied the Roman gods and worshiped Jesus as God. So even if we didn't have the Bible, look what we do have. Okay, look what we have. We have enough right there. We also have a lot of people in present day who have claimed to have had an experience with Jesus. Okay, there are millions of people who make that claim. So to claim that they're all merely superstitious is having a very significant faith position. Okay, just to point out another A couple of other things that I think are important is there are some theories that we can refute. These kind of relate to what David Wood said today, but I just want to highlight a few of them. This idea of a swoon theory where Jesus faked his own death has zero ancient evidence. It also fails to explain the change in the demeanor of the apostles after they saw the risen Jesus. The idea that he had a twin who was crucified instead of him, we have absolutely no ancient evidence on that. And that also would fail to explain why the apostles decided that they'd seen the risen Christ and they preached for him for decades despite massive persecution. The idea that he was buried in a mass grave has no ancient evidence. 1 Corinthians 15 is an early creed within a few years of his resurrection, and that refutes that. Okay, it even mentions that he was buried. The disciples stole the body. There's no body. You would think that the Jews and Romans would have taken it upon themselves to do whatever they could do to find a body to discredit this belief system because they were hostile towards it. But of course, we don't have the body. Of all the prophets from all around the world and all these different faiths, we have bodies for all of them. Muhammad is buried somewhere. He's got his body somewhere. But we don't have anything for Jesus. This idea of a mass hallucination can also be discredited because like dreams, hallucinations are internal. They can't be shared. The idea that the apostles lied, people don't risk their lives for decades for a lie. They were positioned to know the truth. They were uniquely positioned. And just going back to what David Wood said, just to highlight a couple of the things, all Christian churches in China practice some form of healing. And according to some surveys, 90% of new believers cite healing as a reason for their conversion. Okay, so it's pretty important stuff. I think this other quote I think is really important is Charles Colson. He says, "I know the resurrection is a fact and Watergate proved it to me. How? Because 12 men testified that they had seen Jesus raised from the dead. Then they proclaimed that truth for 40 years, never once denying it. Everyone was beaten, tortured, stoned, and put in prison. They would not have endured that if it weren't true. Watergate embroiled 12 of the most powerful men in the world, and they couldn't keep alive for 3 weeks. You're telling me 12 apostles could keep alive for 40 years? Mm-hmm. Exactly. So I want to say thank you, everyone, for coming in today. What is this? Is Lisa here? Lisa Q. Oh, wow. I see Slam and Gavin and Brian. Hi, everybody. Say thank you so much for coming on in. Jesse Camping and Lisa. So I've got a lot of great people in here. And actually, I was just trying to get a date with Lisa and to get her on my channel again, because she and Lori and I do this little female apologetics thing. And I think it's kind of important for some females to go out there and do apologetics because we seem to be very rare. I looked at the what they call the apologetics empire, which is this empire that David Wood, coincidentally, the person who's in this video, that David Wood started. And in the apologetics empire, I noticed that there were 0 females. Okay, there were a whole bunch of men and 0 females. So I don't know why. And I thought to myself, that's strange. But then I actually looked at the books that I'm reading that I have in apologetics. I have only a couple of female authors in the books that I've been reading. Most of the books I get are from males. Most males are the ones who are on the debating circuit. Most males are the ones who are on YouTube. And so this whole idea of females getting out there is sort of rare. So, so females, feel empowered. Go ahead and do this. So I want to say thank you, everybody, for coming in here. I'm going to go ahead and close out this meeting and make sure I do it properly. So hold on. Okay, that's the wrong one. All right, so not sure. All right, I'm going to go ahead and close out the meeting. So thank you so much, everybody, for coming in here. Please like and subscribe and do come again. And one of the things that I've got coming up soon is on the 23rd, I'm going to be on the Modern Day Debate channel debating Jim Majors. So you saw a few of the kind of arguments that I will be using. And I have some other secret arguments that Jim doesn't know about. So if he watches this, he won't get to know what my secret strategy is. So thank you so much. Bye-bye.